This is Lawrence Holgate, once again, the host of Understanding Plato and the author of the book by the same name. Today's episode is a continuation of episode 8. We were talking about meno'sparadox and the theory of recollection that Socrates uses to solve the paradox. The theory of recollection saying that what we know, or what we claim to know, is something that we have achieved or learned in a life previous to the life we are now in. And how do we do that? We have a disembodied soul in a previous life, and it was the soul that took in this learning. He doesn't say how. And what happens in this life is that when we work through an argument, as Plato has the slave boy do, or as Socrates has the slave boy do, the slave boy, in answering Socrates' questions, is really drawing on something that he is recollecting, something he learned in a previous life. He didn't learn it in this life. There's no evidence that the slave boy had any geometry lessons from anyone or learned any geometry theorems. It is simply that he learned, he says yes, he's able to recognize that the answers that he's giving are the correct answers. Socrates, by the way, never says anything, never prompts him, just asks questions. And as they work through the questions, a light bulb goes on in the kid's head, and he gets it right every time. Now, where did he get that knowledge? Socrates says he didn't get it in this life. He turns to Meno and says, "Did you teach him this?" And Meno says, "Of course not. He's a slave boy. He just cleans up the corral." And that's about all he does. No one is secretly teaching him anything. He didn't know the answers to these questions, but he got the answers right. He didn't actually get the answers. Socrates simply prompts him all the way through so that the boy recognizes that whatever Socrates is saying is true. Look, you don't need a complicated geometrical theorem in order to prove, or as an example of what Socrates is doing. You can take any deductive argument. Let's take a short deductive argument about Hercules and Achilles. They are demigods according to ancient Greek literature. That is, they don't live on Mount Olympus with the real gods like Zeus. Now, if a god is a demigod, then that god is mortal. That is, that god can die. So suppose we have step one. We have a three-part argument now. Hercules and Achilles are demigods. Step two, if a god is a demigod, then the god is mortal. Therefore, Hercules and Achilles are mortal. That's all you have to say. Let's start over again. Let's make our first premise the one we used previously. Let's say that if a god is a demigod, then that god is mortal. Hercules and Achilles are demigods. Therefore, Hercules and Achilles are mortal. There's three steps. And if I asked you if you accepted my conclusion, you would say yes. Sounds like a valid argument to me. If those premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Now, did I tell you that? Did I teach you that in this life? And you might say, well, no. Did anybody teach you that? Did you ever have an argument like that in this life? And you might say, no, again. No one taught me that. I just know that if you give me those two premises, that conclusion must be true. Socrates is going to step in and say, well, if you didn't learn it in this life, you must have learned it in a previous life. And we all nod our heads and say, golly, Socrates, I guess you're right. We didn't learn it in this life. We didn't learn that the argument is valid in this life, that the conclusion would be true if given those premises. Therefore, it must be the case that we learned it in a previous life. Now, Socrates uses his geometrical theorem, and we can use my simple argument to show that this conclusion of his is correct. I'm not saying that I'm saying it's correct. Is that let's look at more closely at what Socrates is trying to do. Let's suppose that the theorem, or even my little three-step argument, we're going to call it P. Just give it a letter. Now at 10 a.m. it appears that the boy does not know that the theorem is true. At 10 a.m. also we might say that he does not know that Hercules and Achilles are mortal. Let's suppose he doesn't know that at 10 a.m. Now, at 10:30 a.m., a half hour later, after being asked a few questions, the boy does know that geometrical theorem is true. At 10:30, let's use my example again, he does know that Hercules and Achilles are mortal. He didn't know that prior at 10 a.m. Now, the boy did not acquire the knowledge that the geometrical theorem was true during that interval between 10 and 10:30 a.m. And we can assume, since Meno and Socrates are all standing with the slave boy during the half-hour period, that the boy did not acquire the knowledge that the conclusion was true during that interval between 10 and 10:30. It's not as if he was hooked up to some machine which gave him that knowledge. He's just standing there with these two guys, Meno and Socrates. He's going through the argument or is listening to Socrates as Socrates asks him questions, and he knows something that he did not know at 10 a.m. And no one taught him that in that half-hour period. He got it himself. It was inside him. That knowledge was inside him that Achilles and Hercules, or Hercules and Achilles, were mortal. Now, let's take this as our example and see what we can get out of it. The general conclusion of the whole discussion is that we can inquire about the nature of virtue, and we can do this in the same way that the slave boy comes to profess true beliefs about the geometrical theorem. There are true beliefs in us about the nature of virtue. There are true beliefs in us about a lot of stuff, including the theorem, the geometrical theorem, including the fact that, if we want to take it as a fact, that Hercules and Achilles are mortal. These beliefs can only result in knowledge after we are subjected to a process of questioning, which causes us to recollect these beliefs. As to the metaphysical question about when we originally acquired these beliefs, Socrates says that they have always been in us. Quote, "For it is clear that for all time we either are or are not human beings. Then if the truth about the things that are is always in our soul, the soul is immortal." That's his argument for immortality right there. I'm not going to discuss that right now. We're going to talk about it later when we get to the Republic. But this is one of the earliest conclusions, or at least earliest statements, about the idea of a soul and the immortality of a soul. Now, there is a brief critique that we can give of Socrates' solution. The first thing to note about it, his solution to the meno'sparadox, is that Socrates uses an example of knowledge that is gained a priori to prove his conclusion that knowledge is recollection. The knowledge about the truth of the theorem, or about the truth of the proposition that Hercules and Achilles are mortal, that knowledge is achieved after a process of deduction from premises to conclusion. It's importantly relevant that Socrates does not also attempt to get the slave boy to recollect detailed information about Athenian history. He doesn't do that, about historical stuff about Athens, which the boy has never been taught. Socrates makes no claim that such knowledge, which is called a posteriori knowledge, is acquired by a process of recollection. The paradox he attempts to resolve is not about the acquisition of all knowledge per se. It's only about the acquisition of a priori knowledge, the kind of knowledge we get in mathematics when we come to a conclusion after a long deduction, or the arguments we get in philosophy the arguments that you get in geometry, the knowledge that we have a priori when we discover that if Hercules and Achilles are demigods, and if it's true that if a god is a demigod, then it is mortal, then it must be true that Hercules and Achilles are mortal. That's all a priori knowledge. Then secondly, if we admit that Socrates has proved that the slave boy knows something a priori, why does it follow that recollection is the only explanation of the acquisition of such knowledge? Professor Mark Cohen writes that there are at least 3 explanations, not just one, depending on what it is that allegedly is being recollected. For example, let's take propositions. We could take that as the conclusion. The proposition about the truth of the geometrical theorem that I've called P. They are literally in the soul, unnoticed and waiting to be retrieved. That obviously is what Socrates is accepting. That the knowledge of such propositions, the truth of the geometrical theorem, is literally in the soul, unnoticed and waiting to be retrieved. And according to this reading of the word recollection, propositions can be known a priori. They're literally innate propositions. So you have all this knowledge bouncing around in you before you were born. A second possibility, and here we're dealing with concepts such as the concept of equality, the concept of difference, the concept of odd, the concept of even. We are born with these concepts. We don't acquire them from experience. We make use of these when we confront and organize our raw experiences. Now, according to this reading of recollection, there are a priori concepts that we do have prior to experience. That might be another solution. Prior to experience, we know about equality, we know about difference, we know about odd, etc. Thirdly, let's talk about abilities. This is the one I like, by the way, and I think this is the one which Professor Cohen settles on. Abilities, such as that of reasoning. We are born with the innate ability to derive the logical consequences of our beliefs. We may form our beliefs empirically, but we do not gain our ability to reason empirically. According to this third reading, or interpretation of the word recollection, there is no innate knowledge, and there are no a priori concepts. There is only the ability, and you know what? That's all that Socrates has proved. He simply proved by his examples that we have the ability in us to do deductive logic, and that's about it. Professor Cohen observes that Plato talks as if he has established that first proposition, the propositional knowledge, but the most he establishes really is either 2 or 3, that we are born with concepts or that we are born with abilities. But perhaps that is all that Plato is intending to establish, given what he has previously said. Remember, he said, quote, "True beliefs aren't of much value until someone ties them down by reasoning and explanation." And that, Meno, my friend, is recollection. Well, can't we accept that? Recollection is just tying down through reasoning the explanation for something being true. We don't have to go into a previous life in order to settle this debate, to settle this paradox, and that in effect is what he is saying. So that's it for today. Remember, if you want a copy of Understanding Plato, you can get it digitally, and you can get it in print if you want at Amazon. Under my name, just put in the words Lawrence Holgate. Remember, I've got a U in my last name, Houlgate, and put in the title, Understanding Plato, and it will come right up. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the future, or at least you can listen to me in the future. Bye-bye.